This at hand with our witnesses, and what we will do first is we will turn the floor over to you, Chief, for your opening remarks. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon and thank you. My name is Chief Chris Case. I am the Fire Chief for Chatham-Kent, Ontario, and the co-chair of the Dangerous Goods Committee for the Canadian Association of Fire Chiefs, the national association representing the country's 3,200 fire departments. I'm joined by the CAFC's Executive Director, Dr. Tina Saradine. We appreciate the invitation to discuss the transportation of dangerous goods by rail. Last year, on the 10th anniversary of the tragedy at Lac Magnétique, the Association, in collaboration with Transport Canada, ran a summary of the status of the recommendations made after Canada's largest rail tragedy. We have provided the clerk with a copy of our article. I will highlight some of the actions taken, and then I'll discuss some of the remaining vulnerabilities and our recommendations for a national fire administration and the renewal of emergency preparedness equipment. Before I begin, however, CAFC would like to express continued solidarity with the people of Lac Magnétique, the deceased, the 1,000 firefighters that came to assist, and every community that has ever experienced a tragedy of such proportions. They are not forgotten, and they aspire us to do better. In this regard, after Lac Magnétique, the Transport Safety Board made 5 recommendations. As of 2023, 3 have been met, and 2 remain in progress relating to regulatory oversight and safety management. The government banned one-person crews on trains hauling hazardous cargo and set new standards to make tank cars carrying flammable liquids sturdier. It established stricter accident liability rules, imposed lower speed limits in rural and urban areas, and gave Transport Canada stronger enforcement powers. CAFC was itself involved in developing the Canadian Emergency Response Flammable Liquids Incident in Transportation Training Programme, which is freely available. Rail companies have developed products like AskRail, which are important to first responders. Transport Canada boosted the number of rail safety inspectors to 155 in 2022 from 107 in 2013, and has also quadrupled the tally of inspectors of dangerous goods to 188 from 30. It introduced Directive 36 to ensure that the authorities having jurisdiction have access to information about dangerous goods passing through their communities. Canutech does also important work, and we commend them. So the lessons of Lac Magnétique have not gone unactioned. However, it's one thing to assess the issues of the past, it's another to be proactive for the future. As the TSB correctly concluded, the tragedy at Lac Magnétique is not a result of one person, one issue, one organisation, but their confluence. Today we face the confluence of many new challenges. Last week, close to 50 of my fire chief colleagues were here in Ottawa. They didn't come to talk about rail safety necessarily, but they could have. They talked about fire and life safety issues in building codes, explosives, wildfires and climate change, electric vehicles and rapid housing construction, as examples of why Canada needs a national fire administration. Not only are each of these issues rife with risk, but their convergence could be a disaster of tragic proportions in the blind spot of policymakers. Transportation of dangerous goods by rail is no exception. Can another rail tragedy involving dangerous goods happen today, and how can we prevent it? We need both national coordination and local capacity building. Consider that in my region of Chatham-Kent, the nearest hazmat team is 90 minutes away in Windsor. Emergency response plans may be in place, but I'm yet to see one. In other cities and towns, up to 56% of them, equipment needs to be updated. This is why we are asking the federal government to re-stimulate an investment in fire and emergency equipment through a cost-match programme with other levels of government. It's not the federal government's job to buy our equipment, but it is its job to keep Canada thriving and prepared. At the national level, new risks need to be coordinated to avert the disasters of tomorrow. They can't be studied in silos by committee or by department. They can't be solely in Ottawa or in isolation. They need an holistic, national and systematic approach and oversight to fire and life safety issues in coordination with fire service experts. This is what a national fire administration could provide you. This is what other countries do. It's what's needed here, and it's not about jurisdiction or money. It's about linking subject matter expertise with policy coordination proactively and not in retrospect. This is our most important recommendation to you. Thank you for considering, thank you for your time, and thank you for your attention. we look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Chief Case. We'll now go to Mr. Masterson, joining us by video conference. Mr. Masterson, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Chair. It's a pleasure to be with the committee today on behalf of CIAC. Our chemistry and plastics industry is your third largest manufacturing sector in Canada and the second largest rail shipper. About 80% of all that we make in Canada is shipped by rail, and we take our responsibilities for the safe production, safe handling, and safe transportation of our products very seriously. What I want to share with you is we don't just meet regulatory requirements, we go well beyond those. And we can talk about some of our responses to some of the questions that you had earlier as you see fit. So 40 years ago this month, in fact, and in response to the Mississauga train derailment and other incidents, our association founded Responsible Care to improve our safety performance, but most importantly, to improve trust with the communities we operate in and the communities that we move our products through. And today, participation in Responsible Care is a condition of membership in our association. There are many commitments to transportation safety in Responsible Care, and those are audited within our member companies every 3 years, and that includes transportation emergency management. Let me just share 2 aspects of Responsible Care that relate most closely to the transportation of dangerous goods. First, very clearly, we are committed to the public right to know and understand the risks and the benefits of the products that travel through their communities, whether by rail, road, ship, or pipeline. And in partnership with the Railway Association of Canada, we operate TransCare, the Transportation Community Awareness Emergency Response Initiative. And TransCare members, they work with municipal officials, the emergency responders, whether staff or volunteers, and residents along the transportation routes. And we work to assist them in developing and evaluating their own community emergency response plans. Highlight a drawing card, if you will, of these outreach sessions and education sessions we try to do is our safety train. And this is a converted rail car. It's a classroom on wheels, and it travels across Canada from spring through fall to a wide number of communities to acts of focal point to bring the shippers, the railways, the emergency response contractors, the first responders, elected officials together to build relationships and talk about these goods and how to manage them safely. So it does provide hands-on training to first responders and community, raises awareness of the products going through and the risks, and it supports the first responders in being prepared to respond to emergencies involving our members' goods. Most importantly, though, and we hear this all the time, the main benefit of TransCare is building trust and relationships between the first responders in the communities and the industry, whether the shippers, the railways, or the emergency contractors, so that when those people do arrive on site, everybody knows what everybody's job is. They're trusted. They know the information they're being provided is appropriate and accurate. Thank you. In recent years, just discussed by the Chief, a lot of attention has been focused on the movement of dangerous goods. There's been a lot of changes to the regulatory environment, and we've been very pleased to see many other organizations join ourselves in the Railway Association of Canada in these TransCare outreach efforts and commit themselves to engagement and training with first responders. That includes groups like the Emergency Response Assistance Canada, ERAC, the Association of Fire Chiefs, Canadian Emergency Response Contractors Alliance, Canadian Fuels Association, and Responsible Distribution Canada, and others. Second, our members are also obligated to ensure, and this comes up a bit in the questions you were asking, to ensure that they use only certified professionals with adequately trained personnel that have the equipment and the training to handle the specific commodities that our members are shipping. One emergency response personnel is not the same as another. What is their training? How well equipped are they? Do they have the right equipment to respond to the emergencies involving our members' products? And this is done through another initiative called the Transportation Emergency Assistance Program, or TEAP. It's actually TEAP version 3 is what we're at now. We refer to it as TEAP 3. And through our TEAP and our partners, we've established and we do maintain a national emergency response network that's capable of safely and efficiently mitigating the impacts of a chemical transportation incident anywhere in the country. There are standards that must be met and regularly reconfirmed. So these are registered emergency response contractors, a registration process to ensure that those people, again, are adequately and appropriately trained to respond to these emergencies. And we do work with many others, including the Railway Association, the 2 Class 1 railways, and others on that process. I'm very proud of the work we do on transportation safety. Our members experience far fewer and far less severe incidents than in the past. But nevertheless, transportation safety, including that of especially of dangerous goods, requires constant vigilance and a constant commitment to continual improvement. So we definitely commend this committee and its attention to this activity. Probably there's nowhere in public policy in Canada that we have seen more change and more reform than in transportation dangerous goods over the last 10 to 12 years. And that's okay. That's appropriate. And the spirit which Transport Canada, the Government of Canada, and all the stakeholders come together to advance that is probably not seen in any other area of public policy we work with. And even participating in this discussion and see how you interact as a committee, it's quite unique. And so never forget that all the stakeholders involved are committed to this. The voluntary work we do through responsible care is not a substitute for regulation. You will never hear us say that. It is a demonstration that a committed industry can establish and can demand performance standards well beyond regulation and that meet Canadians' expectations for our industry. So thank you for the opportunity. I do look forward to your questions, especially related to the many improvements in rail safety and especially those around improvements to community awareness in this area. So thank you very much for the time.
Much, Mr. Masterson. And as we are discussing transport by rail, I have my own rail signals here. And yellow, I forgot to point out at the beginning of the meeting, is for 30 seconds left, and red means that don't force me to cut you off. I don't want to do it, but I will have to keep us on time.
I look at the camera, so I saw your eyes. Sorry, you were in the other corner of my screen. My apologies.
Thank you very much, Mr. Masterson. No, it's I who should apologize. Présentement, on va passer la parole à Monsieur.
I'll give the floor to Mayor Lessard. You have the floor for 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I first want to thank the members and congratulate them. That is the members of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee for doing this study. I was pleased as well to hear Mr. Masterson and Mr. Case, and one produces dangerous goods and the other one deals with incidents when they arise. I have 3 points. That is safety for our community, preparation for emergency situations, especially in rural areas. Now, a bit of background. Saint-Basile-le-Grand is semi-rural with 5,500 inhabitants, and 78% of the territory is protected as agricultural land. We have trains over in our area all the time, and many other communities do as well in Quebec. So we don't always get preventive information. We need that. And we are always concerned about the possibility of a derailment in the urban area. As I said, I have a list of various threats. We've got the speed of freight trains coming through our municipalities, the number of rail cars. We see errors with signals. The gates come down when there's no train. We see stopped trains that cut our municipality in two. And then we have dangerous goods that we don't have any information about, and so we wouldn't know how to respond if there was an accident. Over the past 2 or 3 years, the situation has worsened further. We are getting more vibration now because we have trains coming through day and night. And this is very disturbing. Even in the winter, when we have our windows closed, we get this noise, the clacking. When we don't know what the contents are, the municipalities have to respond if there is an incident on our territory. We may have long-term damage to buildings and public institutions. Basile-le-Grand is split in two by the rail line. And when we have a long freight train, it cuts people off from areas, and cars, vehicles can't get out of the south part of the municipality and vice versa. And so if there is any emergency situation, a medical emergency or another one, then there's no way to respond. And this exposes the public to dangers, and we could have flammable or other dangerous goods that are released. It makes it difficult for vehicles and pedestrians to move around. There is a consensus in the Association of Municipalities of Quebec to try to work with the rail companies to deal with the problem at the source. But it is difficult because we have to realize right now that we have this difficult situation. The train is the best way of moving large volumes of people. That is the reality, because public transit is one of the best ways of dealing with the environmental problems of transportation. And dealing with your main question, we need to have sections of rail lines that are dedicated to the various types of use, that is, passenger or freight rail. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your invitation. There are no requirements for trains to there should be no obligation for trains to go through municipalities, because it used to be for agricultural reasons, but this is no longer the case. We need to find ways to make freight movement more safer, and we've got some suggestions to give when there are questions. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
The floor is yours. You have 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of the witnesses that have taken the time to be here. I'll start with my questions for Mr. Masterson. And back some years ago, in my private sector life before politics, I worked at a company that was actually part of Responsible Care, and so have some familiarity with that. And of course, like all industries and industry organizations, there's multiple acronyms. So you've enlightened us on a few new ones today. So TransCare, maybe you can talk a bit more about that. When you started that, what were the goals, and did you benchmark sort of where things were at in 1985 and where you were headed? And
well, tough to think back then. It was a long time, but what I can talk more about is where we are and where we're going. And so what's the goal? The goal of Responsible Care writ large was to build trust. You know, there's that expression, nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care. And we want to be able to demonstrate to the communities we operate in, the communities we move our products through, that we do care and that we know what the right thing to do is, that we want input on that, and that we can do it. And again, that includes with transportation. There's no question communities are under-resourced. It's not always a top-of-mind priority with all the pressures on communities. We have a duty to help them be as prepared as they can. One of the things that's been most interesting in recent years is the amount of increased attention specifically to communities that rely on volunteer firefighters, volunteer first responders, pardon me. And so one of the newest things we've done, you know, Responsible Care is very revolutionary, TransCare as well. What we've done in recent years, and with the assistance of the Government of Canada, is we have integrated a virtual reality approach into TransCare. So you can put on these goggles and you can do the walkthrough and you can go through all the training modules as if you were physically with this train car, because in most instances where we have a Transcare event in a larger community, maybe it's Sarnia, maybe it's London, Ontario, or Medicine Hat, Alberta, you're talking about bringing the first responders together for 2-3 days. They'll do simulated rollovers. They'll talk to the shippers and the railways. There's a lot of activity taking place. Well, someone who's got a full-time job and their volunteer firefighter can't dedicate that time. So we're trying to be responsive to the realities of today's world and make sure that those communities are also getting served by these programs. So that would be one example.
Can I ask then, are there some metrics or numbers that you could point to just in terms of the success of the program?
I can certainly get the numbers of how many communities we serve and how many first responders would participate in a year. Those would have to come after this meeting.
If you could table that with the committee, that'd be instructive. In terms of an industry-led initiative, a proactive initiative, how and I know that of course with the alliance with the Railway Association, this of course is North American. Are there other jurisdictions in the world that have good examples that we should be looking to in terms of how they manage dangerous goods on the rails?
Well, I think there's really no comparison to the U.S. and Canada in terms of the reliance on the economy for rail and how much it's integrated. Certainly in Europe, you've got more movement by barge, et cetera. So I think it's there that we need to focus, and it's also the integrated nature of our economy and the integrated nature of the rail system to make sure that what we're doing in Canada doesn't create a sticky border for the movement of goods, because that's not of anybody's interest. So we can align, we can drive improvements in areas that are unique to Canada. Nothing particular comes to mind, but I would say, again, Canada is a leader, right? The range of reforms the fire chief talked about after Lac-Mégantic, the commitment by governments, all governments, and by all stakeholders in the transportation value chain to prevent that from ever happening again is very serious. And so we have taken the best of what's coming out of the United States in terms of new tank car standards and other things, but look at ERAPs as one example, and we can talk more about those. But one of the key calls for action for the United States after the East Palestine incident was, well, why don't we have ERAPs like Canada does? So there's some good things up here. The work is, and what's next? It's not, we don't have anything, it's not functioning, it's not good. It's like, where are we and where's the best place we can make more improvements with best efforts going forward?
Thank you. That's helpful. And I want to, just in the remaining time, and I'll probably have to pick it up in the next round, ask a question of Chief Case. You talked about the National Fire Administration, and maybe, is that sort of like FEMA? Is that sort of what you're envisioning, or how is the comparison?
Thank you for the question. So FEMA is a much larger infrastructure. What the fire chiefs are proposing is something that's turnkey, that's accessible, and that can be done rapidly. So it's about linking and coordinating fire service expertise with federal policy priorities. So, for example, if we're introducing rapid new housing, we're doing so without having fire and life safety issues in a blind spot. So the Fire Administration in the United States is the nucleus. It's inside of FEMA. And what we're saying here is that we need a similar coordination body.
Thank you very much, Mr. Muse. Next, we'll go to Mr. Iachino. Mr. Iachino, the floor is yours. You have 6 minutes. Vous avez 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And my questions are going to be addressed to Mr. Case and Mr. Masterson. If you can just give me short answers. Many communities in Canada are crossed by rail lines carrying goods of all kinds, including dangerous goods. And in 2023, 1,235 rail transportation events, including 914 accidents, were reported to Transportation Safety Board of Canada. Of these, 87 accidents involved dangerous goods, and 6 resulted in a product release. After Lac-Mégantic, are communities today that cross by rail lines aware of the type of goods transported? And if so, are they informed before or after trains pass through?
Yeah, maybe I can start, or the chief. I defer to the chief.
One or the other. Go ahead.
Okay, well, let me start. The first is yes. And so one of the key measures after Lac Mégantic was so-called Protective Directive 36. And so the railways must provide the registered municipalities with information on the dangerous goods that go through those communities, and they must do that twice annually. So is that every shipment? Do they know? Not necessarily beforehand, but I'm coming back to that. The chief also mentioned this earlier, but that's the first piece. So every community has the ability to look at that list and see what's going through, and how that community wishes to communicate that information to its own citizens is at their discretion. The second thing the chief mentioned, a very important piece, which is the Ask Rail initiative, if you will. And so a first responder, anybody really that's registered, can go on, and if you see a tank car, when the mayor talked about, hey, there's tank cars on a intersection, and I don't know what's in them. You simply put the number of that car in, and it will tell you what's in that car at that time. So that information is available. And again, the other initiative, which is more happens after the fact, is the CanUtech information. When you can have an incident, you can get instantaneous results 24/7 from the CanUtech initiative. First responders, especially those with the competencies and people, when we talked about ERAPs, remember when these get tested, if you will, on an ongoing basis, that's part of the requirement. So typically a company will sit down, whoever owns the ERAP, it'll be the shipper, the rail company, could be a trucking company as well, the emergency contractors, and the first responders on the routes for that product. And they're going to sit down every year and refresh their knowledge of that chemistry, that substance, what's going through, and how they have to respond to incidents. So there's a range of things, but those are key aspects.
Thanks, Chief. Would you like to add to this?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's worth noting we do get the information from Directive 36, which comes twice a year. And from our perspective, we use that for our training. But do we know what's coming through on a day-to-day basis? No. And it's worth noting that whilst we assume that we can provide this adequate response, the municipality will set the level of service for that fire department based upon their own needs, circumstances, and more importantly, their own tax base. So there is this vision that we can have firefighters who can arrive immediately at the scene of a derailment or a release of a chemical and be able to immediately get to work. And that might not always be the case.
If I may just interject, so has it improved since Lac Mégantic for the cities to be aware? Has it improved in some way, or there's still a lot of room for improvement? That's my first question. And second question is, do the cities that are affected by this crossing of rail lines, are they equipped to have the proper emergency plans if ever there would be an incident arriving?
To answer your first question, as we said in our opening statement, it's certainly improved. Are the cities equipped? Well, that very much depends on the city. In some cities, there may be a very highly functioning hazardous materials response team. In other cities, there may be a very basic firefighting component. And those levels of service will dictate what that city can do. We heard from Transport Canada at the last meeting, I was advised that we're talking about doing mass evacuations in a very short space of time. That's a very difficult thing to do, I can tell you, as somebody who's done it a number of times, to try and evacuate a large area. So my message would be that whilst there have been improvements, as we've pointed out today, there's certainly a lot of room for improvement and a lot of room to improve the safety of our communities.
What role do the railways police force play when there is a rail incident involving the release or potential release of dangerous goods? Is their role the same in all the cities, or it varies depending on what type of police force exists?
I can comment from my own circumstances and what I've heard from members. The rail police is our first point of contact normally through our own police dispatch. And again, that very much depends on where the police are based and how long it will take them to respond to the scene, which I imagine would be part of these emergency action plans. So what we're talking about here is very much a continental issue, and it's very difficult to apply a standard response across the breadth of Canada and North America to say that we've got a standard response to all the issues, with the difference in communities, language, landscape, and all the other factors that may change.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Iacono. Prochainement, nous avons Monsieur Barcelou-Duval.
We will now go to Mr. Barcelou-Duval. You have 6 minutes, please. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first of all, thank you to all the witnesses for being here with us today. I will begin with the Mayor of Saint-Basile, Mr. Lessard. My first question for you, and this hasn't been raised right up to now, but that is that the rail companies inform the municipalities once or twice a year the list of dangerous goods that move through their municipalities, and that the municipalities can inform the public of the 10 main dangerous goods types. Is that sufficient for you? No. That approach might reassure some people who might feel it is adequate, but it is not, because it really has no value. We can have the whole list of dangerous goods that move through our municipality by rail, but when there is an incident or an accident, such as a derailment, then we need to know what the goods are that are involved. If we have that other list, we still don't know what is in the specific cars that have derailed. And it's really when there is a release of dangerous goods that we need to have that, because we can't be always ready for every type of incident. We need to know how to deal with them. So, in other words, that type of list doesn't really resolve the problem. It may provide some comfort to those that feel that there's no real danger if we know what the list of products is. But in fact, it is even more worrying and operationally doesn't help. Thank you, Mayor. I have another question for you. Mr. Case, I believe, Fire Chief Case, mentioned earlier that preparation can depend and vary from one municipality to another, depending on their state of readiness and depending on the type of goods. A municipality doesn't have the resources to deal with the incident. And so there's a sort of transfer of risk in those situations. Do you feel that it is reasonable that the municipalities have to assume all the risk? No, especially because this is an economic activity that is initiated by the producers and by the rail companies. We are the ones that have to clean up the mess if there is an incident or an accident. Regarding the first part of your question, this degree of readiness does vary a great deal from one place to another, but even if you have the resources, it's kind of a Russian roulette system. You can be very well prepared for one thing. And for example, we had a PCB spill a few years ago, and we didn't know what to do. We used foam, and it wasn't the right approach. So even if you have a lot of financial resources, there are dozens of types of dangerous goods. So it's kind of like Russian roulette. You can't know how to deal with everything properly. Today, we talked about the emergency response assistance plans that the rail companies have to provide to Transport Canada. To your knowledge, since Transport Canada has an oversight role. Has there been any discussion with Transport Canada regarding the ERAPs or the firefighters? Have there been any discussions with Transport Canada on this? Yes, but we kind of go in circles because all of the measures that we can put in place are aimed at reacting after a disaster happens. Most of the economic sectors, depending on their types of activity, try to reduce or eliminate risk at the source. But in this case, that would mean bypassing municipalities where there is a population. So I'll conclude on this point, Mr. Chairman. We often say that lac mégantic is a good incentive, but that's after the fact. They suffered greatly, and steps need to be taken proactively.
Floor is yours. 6 minutes, please.
Chair, I'm struck by those last comments and also by the fact that the improvements that we've seen, so many of them, like Directive 36, are written in the blood of people who have lost their lives in disasters. And I think what we're trying to do here at this committee through this study is to look down the road and try to strengthen the protective system without it costing the lives of our neighbors. And so, thinking about what we've heard around these plans and preparedness, and I'm struck by Chief Case's words about Canada's geography and the difficulty of applying a standard response across Canada. And that hits home because the part of Canada that I represent is a region of rural and remote communities. And yet the same volumes of goods go through our communities as go through downtown Edmonton. And so it seems that the risk is dictated by the products and the capacity for response is dictated by the tax base. Could you talk a little bit about the challenges, the unique challenges that small rural fire departments face when dealing with the volumes of hazardous goods that we're talking about moving through our towns?
Thank you for the question. Through you, Mr. Chair. Between you and Mayor Lessard, you've hit most of the issues that we would talk about. If you're talking about your own area, it's a volunteer area. They, as you've seen from our census that we referred to, 56% of our reported fire departments are struggling to maintain basic equipment for firefighting. Being able, because of the increase in the cost of fire trucks, which have gone up massively over the past 2 years, the cost of training, the cost of PPE, some of our fire chiefs are struggling to maintain a basic firefighting provision. What we're talking about now is a highly technical hazardous materials response to a really complex incident that would challenge any fire chief. So when it comes to the risks, you're quite correct. We've talked a lot about the preparation and about the strengthening of rail cards and to try and prevent the incident from happening, but we're also now talking about when the unknown happens. And our business is the unforeseeable. We're the people that get called when there's an unforeseeable incident. And it's really difficult to maintain that level of response across such a wide area. But it would also be very difficult for your local municipality to fund the level of response that might be needed to deal with this catastrophic incident.
I wanted to ask about the cost of providing capacity. As a former mayor, I know that small municipalities are stretched when it comes to their resources. Small fire departments are stretched, as you've just mentioned. And yet the companies shipping goods through our communities, many of them have, millions, if not billions of dollars in revenue. And the costs don't seem equitably distributed. Should the costs of responding to major industrial spills and fires along the rail line be borne by municipal property taxpayers? Is it fair?
Through you, Mr. Chair. If we had a chemical factory built in your area, the E2 regulations and the rest of the federal regulations would demand that that plant not only is safe to operate, but has mitigation plans should there be a leak within that plant. It's not fair because you've now got that risk that travels at speed through different areas. And I'll also concede to Mr. Matheson, it's incredibly difficult to have a response that can follow that risk. But you are quite correct. In a lot of the areas where these trucks are going through, the first responders will not be equipped. They won't be trained. And it's very difficult. We're seeing recruitment of volunteer firefighters become harder and harder because of the changes in people's lives and the way that they work. We're also seeing that in some provinces, there's you have to be licensed as a firefighter the same way that a full-time firefighter is. So the costs are not going down, and the level of technical response needed for an incident like this would be extreme.
So, given all of that, how do we protect residents in small communities? I'm thinking about my community of Smithers. You know, it's named after the chairman of the railroad. It's a railroad town. There are hundreds of people who live right along the rail line, who live and work in close proximity to those trains that are coming through. Given the challenges around capacity, how do we protect their lives?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Overall, there's got to be prevention rather than response. So the work that is taking place to improve safety, that has got to be the way to deal with this. But there has to be an acknowledgement that not only a risk to life, but also a risk to the community and also a risk to the environment. There has to be investment that at least that stopgap that's put in place until the industry experts show up can be effective. So I realise I'm not answering your question because it's a very difficult one to answer. But
some of the most difficult scenarios to talk about are these worst-case scenarios that are extremely high consequence. And so if we're talking about multiple rail cars on fire in the heart of a community, which we've seen, at risk of BLEVE, these boiling liquid evaporating vapor explosions, is it reasonable to expect there to be a response that prevents the loss of human life? Like, as a resident, I would sure hope that it is. But when you look at the hard facts, when you look at the time required to evacuate, you look at the number of people that would need to be evacuated, you look at the capacity of the community, it really stretches the imagination to understand how a small fire department would get people out of the way.
I'll let you respond, Chief Case.
thank you, Mr. Chair. With the hazardous materials incident, the incident commander has got two very definite options. Move the people away from the bad stuff or move the bad stuff away from the people. So at the very least, there's got to be a response where you can do a meaningful evacuation. That is training and awareness and community education so that people are aware that this stuff is coming through the municipality. And the evacuation plan. You basically, and again, I'm speaking from a professional perspective, you're seeking an element of self-evacuation to effectively get people away from this. Whether a crew can arrive and immediately mitigate a BLEVE or something like that, that is nearly impossible at times. You really do have to put as much water on it as you can and get everybody away for up to 24 hours.
Thank you very much, Chief Case, and thank you, Mr. Backrath. Mr. Muse, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes, sir.
So, Chief Case, you said, of course, prevention versus response is obviously the preferred way of going about things. And so I asked actually Transport Canada officials last meeting about Directive 36 and the frequency by which data is provided to communities about what's traveling through. And you had said earlier on that the data is primarily used for training purposes because it's periodic and it's after the fact. And I asked them whether real-time data was possible, and they didn't seem to think so. So I'm just wondering, what would be optimal in terms of, achieving a frequency of data that would give you something to actually act upon and prepare for in the vein of that prevention, rather than just receiving something after the fact and using it only for training purposes? What would be possible?
Thank you for the question. Through you, Mr. Chair. Knowing that something is coming through the area with a couple of hours' notice might not be any help at all. But if there was trends analysis to show that, I'll give you an example. I look at my own Directive 36 data, and it used to be very much alcohols. And we have a plant we have a plant that manufactures alcohol in Chatham, Kent, and we're very used to dealing with that. But then we began to see a sudden increase in lithium-ion batteries. So if there's any way that we can predict, if Transport Canada could say, listen, there is a plant coming online, there's a contract coming where we might start seeing different things, that could be helpful. We could actually get ahead of this and start proactively training rather than reactively training. That would be one suggestion I would make.
So the Canadian Association of Fire Chiefs was involved, you indicated, in the post-Lac Mégantic regulations on flammable liquids. And so, obviously there has been some improvements, and you've indicated that as well. Are there still some very obvious gaps or lags, some low-hanging fruit that could be addressed quickly?
Thank you for the question. Absolutely. And like Chief Case said, it's not just about where we are post-Lac Mégantic and the recommendations. It's about the new challenges that we haven't seen before. So Chief Case gave the example of lithium-ion batteries. Is that even on the radar of tracking, right? So this is why the fire chiefs are calling for a National Fire Administration. The fire chiefs know what the risks are. In fact, we've met with 56 countries over the summer at the World Fire Congress. And these issues need to be brought by the forefront, like Chief Case said, in a holistic and systematic way. They can't be in your blind spot. And we don't expect policymakers to be fire chiefs. We expect them to be policymakers. They need a mechanism to coordinate and get fire service expertise like the one that we're lucky to have here today.
Thank you. Mr. Masterson, you talked about the fact that you're focused on the future, and you talked, I think, about some virtual reality technology. This is all beyond me, but actually I had a chance last month to see at a Leona training center the use of this virtual technology in training people on equipment, which I thought was interesting. And so maybe you can talk a bit about some of the new technology and innovations are being used through your association and your association's members. That's going to help change this landscape in the future. I mean, we can talk about what's been done in the past, but there may be tech that's going to really help advance things and make things safer. Just because where we are, 40 years from when responsible care actually started. Your sound is not working.
Sorry, Mr. Masson. I'll let you start your response again, sir.
Thank you. I would certainly encourage this committee to speak directly to the railways. There have been a number of comments here that are simply factually not true, and they are the real driving force for rail safety. And you look at the equipment and the spend that CN and CPKC have put towards improved rail safety. They're best to talk about that. What I would say is the job of either preparing for, preventing, and responding to an emergency is not borne solely by the municipalities. Industry, from the shippers right through the railway providers and the emergency contractors, do shoulder a lot of those costs. So those smaller communities, when you do talk to the railways, ask them about how they pre-position emergency response equipment so that it is available in those instances where it takes more time to get there. There's a lot of work. It's good work. We're all in this together, and it's not a case of industry, railways especially, trying to dodge their responsibilities. I think Canada's two Class 1 railways are incredible leaders in rail safety.
Thank you.
There's always more to do, but they will work with you to get there. Please do speak to them directly.
Thank you very much, Mr. Masterson. Next, we'll go to Mr. Badaway. Mr. Badaway, the floor is yours. 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to drill down a bit more on the overall planning and protocols that, Chief, you're a part of. And quite frankly, when you see the panel here today, for the most part, these are people that would otherwise sit around the table when you have those situations. Prevention is first and foremost, and with that, disaster mitigation, something that this government has invested in through the past 3 or 4 years, both from the operational as well as the capital side, are extremely important. The CERTs, the community emergency response teams that you put in place, from the operational side, evaluating the risks within the municipality, which I'll get back to in a second, And with that, recognizing, as was just mentioned, the sectors that are well-equipped, rail, industry, et cetera, from having the capital side of it in terms of equipment in place or overall planning with the certs that are part of the community. As well, the capital. When I say the capital, I mean really taking into consideration the secondary planning, and to actually recognize, that if you have a leak from a train, it may leach into the water system. So how important it is to also have a part of the process, the engineers of the city, public works, operations, and others, such as that, coordination, training, communication. How do you inform the public? Sometimes it's quiet, 3 o'clock in the morning. How's the public informed not to drink the water the next day? And of course, plans and protocols attached to that. So to you, Chief, with all that said, run us through the process of, one, who should be sitting around that table? 2, an example of the prevention models that your exercises are participating in with those people. And 3, how far do you go with those that you would otherwise include around that table, including your, not just the obvious in terms of the emergency responders, but also the others in terms of the city's operations, jurisdictional operations, and others that are very relevant to individual situations. And by the way, and the capital needed to pay for that.
Thank you for the question. Through you, Mr. Chair. We're getting into 2 very different focuses here. So we have emergency response and we have emergency management. And in a lot of areas, the fire chief is both the emergency management coordinator and the fire chief. So in the event that the incident takes place, the emergency response will immediately go. That level of response is determined by council, whether or not they are in a hazmat operations, technical, or even just an awareness. And an awareness is that they can actually identify what's on fire, what's involved, and then call for help. That's about all they can do, and then they can do evacuations and the like. Should that then become something that is beginning to impact large numbers of people, as you know, the Mayor might declare an emergency operations centre will be declared, and that is when you do get the industry partners, you get all the community partners, that's the director of the PUC, police, EMS, fire, all the municipal departments, even some of the charities are then around that table trying to manage the incident and support the operations that are going ahead. That is an immense, I'm speaking as somebody who's had 3 ongoing emergencies simultaneously at one time. That basically stops your municipality and you're all working just to deal with an emergency. It's incredibly time consuming, it's incredibly impactful on all the members of staff, and not to mention the actual trauma that it brings to the community. So, to answer your question, it very much depends on what it is we're dealing with. I will say one thing, when Lac Magnétique happened, I was still in the UK. We studied it as firefighters. And I recall seeing a firefighter say that he arrived to a wall of fire and there was nothing they could do. There is nothing more helpless in a firefighter's mind than to show up at an incident and not be able to do anything. That is the problem that you face. We can have all the safety issues we want and we can have all the safety plans, but in that time between it happening and us actually getting control of the situation, that's when that time belongs to the community.
Thanks, Chief. Now, sometimes we have to recognize the reality of a situation we may be involved in with respect to the financing. I know in my day, when I was involved in some of those situations, I had on my right my clerk, and I had on my left my director of corporate services, which was our finance. And there are decisions that have to be made on the fly with respect to finance. And so my question to you is depending on the capacity of the jurisdiction, the community, is there a need for financial support in individual circumstances? First, within the operations. Second, primarily beforehand within the capital side of it, that both the federal government as well as the provinces and the territories can participate in, so that therefore it doesn't simply default on the property taxpayer or the water wastewater bill ratepayer.
Thank you for the question. What I can tell you is out of the 3 emergency services in my area, police is always very well funded because it's very political. Police usually get quite a lot of grant money and they're also not particularly equipment heavy. You get an incident, you might have an officer arriving in a car. EMS is 50% funded by the province of Ontario. If you have a house fire, you've probably got about $8 million worth of equipment showing up, and all of that is on the property taxpayer, every single bit. So, as we've said in our opening statement, we need to start looking at ways that we can actually get equipment to the scene and keep our firefighters equipped so that they can deal with all ranges of incidents, not just the huge ones that we're talking about today.
Thank you very much,
Am I out of
Mr.
time,
Badaway.
Mr. Chairman?
Pardon?
Am I out of time?
You are out of time, sir.
One more quick question.
Well over time, but I didn't want to cut off Chief Case. He was making very valid points that were interesting to the committee. Prochainement, nous avons Monsieur Barcelou-Duval, 2 minutes et demie, s'il vous plaît.
We will now go to Mr. Barcelou-Duval. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to follow up on the comments made by Mr. Masterson, I believe, from the Chemistry Association. That is that the cost of the response is really borne by the municipalities. And I want to check with Mayor Lessard. In your opinion, because I'm not a specialist in how this works, when we have carriers, I don't know whether CP or CN. In your case, I imagine it's CN. Do they pay for the fire station or firefighters? Or, from what I know, they help with some training. But all the other costs, who bears those? Is it the municipality or the rail company? It's the municipality. And one thing that you need to realize is that our firefighters are very well trained and they do a good job when there is an accident. We can therefore react to an incident or an accident. But what I am concerned about is not just the costs, but it seems that we are focused on reacting to incidents and accidents, but we aren't doing much to prevent them. For example, we seem to be comfortable saying, here's a list of hazardous goods. Well, we can provide that to the public, too. But that will do nothing to prevent an accident or an incident. What are the companies, including the rail carriers, doing to prevent an incident or an accident at the source? Since I don't have very much time, I have to interrupt. You make a very good point. I just want to come back to costs. Do you feel that the cost sharing is fair? No, not at all, because the rail companies don't provide any of the costs. The municipalities have to do that, and the rail companies and the producers of the hazardous goods that come through our municipality don't play any part in dealing with situations or paying for the firefighters. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chief Case, you described situations in which it's just not going to be possible for local fire departments to attack a fire, to get in there and respond directly, and that there's a need to get people out. There's a need for people to self-evacuate. It would seem to me that this is made harder by the emergency response distance that's recommended, 450 meters. Now, I talked to a local fire chief who spoke of the challenge that presents for firefighters, because the people in that radius are their neighbors. And it's going to be very difficult to hold them back when they know people that work in those buildings right next to the railroad. What is the best practice for alerting people and quickly evacuating them from situations where first responders can't get close enough to knock on their door?
Thank you for the question. Through you, Mr. Chair. It's very difficult to pin down a best practice because, again, this comes down to geography and other such things. Alerting people can be done through, we've used reverse 911 systems, we've used systems of alerting through mobile phones. We can actually do the the federal alert and the provincial alerts, which alerts everybody's phones. But again, that all takes time. And in my experience, the most effective way of evacuating people is where someone has to knock on the door and basically say, you need to leave. You know, people will see something on their phone, and when they get that trusted face at the door, then, and I've seen firefighters and police officers pleading with people to leave their homes. We can't force anybody to leave their homes. So in terms of best practice, that would really be an interesting point from a federal perspective about what would be the best way to do this over a wider area. But I accept your chief's point. Some of the evacuation distances listed in the ERG are flabbergasting. I mean, we're talking kilometres, you know, especially at night when people are asleep, and it is significantly a challenge.
Could I fit in one quick question to Mayor Lessard?
Depends
I
how
know
good
you've
you are.
been
You have
very
40
patient
seconds,
with
sir.
me. How many seconds?
40 seconds.
Okay. Mr. Mayor, I wonder if I could ask you, based on what you know about your community and what you've heard at these hearings, whether you feel your residents are adequately protected from major incidents involving dangerous goods.
La réponse est non.
My answer is no. They are not well protected. Thank you.
Merci
You
beaucoup,
did that
Monsieur
very
Ma-
quickly. Thank
Next.
you, Mayor.
Mr. Lawrence, you have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you very much. And I've listened to the testimony intently, and I think I've picked up a fairly considerable disconnect between what Mr. Masterson is saying and then what the mayor and the chief are saying. And I want to be clear here. I'm not blaming anyone. I just want to get to the root of it and solve and hopefully help solve this issue. So, I'll start with you, Mr. Masterson. Do you believe it would be of value if, in fact, one of these high consequence events were to happen for the first responders to have information with respect to the potentially dangerous substances that might be manufactured by your members? And perhaps you could expand, if you don't mind, as to what the differences or responses might be with respect to maybe a couple of the most dangerous chemicals that would be produced by your members there.
We'll start with your first question. Certainly, the disconnect you spoke about, I don't think there's a disconnect. I think we're talking about a lot of different things, and they're getting twisted together. So we hear about prevention, then we hear about response. And what I was saying about who bears the cost for prevention, there were many millions of dollars spent, tens of millions, on the upgrades to new rail cars to keep the product in. I think we heard 2,000 violations of the regulations, but only, what was it I heard? 8 of them led to a release? That's 8 too many. But that's because of the equipment that's put in place, the tank car standards, the investments the railways have made on, we used to have a lot of incidents because of bearings overheating. That's almost eliminated because of the boxes they have that every single car, every bearing is tested or signaled. So that's the disconnect here. There's a lot of money spent on prevention. Don't lose sight of that.
But what I was trying to get at, though, is that it appears as though your evidence or testimony is that your industry provides information as to the contents of various freight trains and otherwise, but it doesn't appear as though that information is actually being of much value, if I can be candid, with our first responders. And I'm just looking to bridge that gap. And surely the chemicals that you would have, different chemicals would require different responses, would have,
absolutely,
and perhaps most importantly, might have different impacts on first responders who are rushing in there to save people.
Absolutely. So 3 quick responses. First of all, there was a misstatement earlier. It is not the railways that prepare the ERAPs. It's the producers or the importers of the substance that's regulated that prepares the ERAPs and how it has to be administered. So that's an important piece of information right there for you to make sure that you understand. again, that ERAP will talk about the means of containment, and that will differ depending on the commodity in question. Certainly, you may wish to look in a little bit deeper about toxic inhalation hazards and those few substances where that's ammonia, chlorine, ethylene oxide, and how those get managed. One of the things to remember, and the question about prevention came up, and this is really important too, where industry has the choice, it will not ship those products. So if you're making ethylene oxide and you have a customer that wants to turn into another product, guess what? You're going to locate on that site where it's produced, so it doesn't have to go on the tracks to begin with. But when you talk about farming and we have to move around anhydrous ammonia or water treatment for municipalities, these goods must be moved. There are residual risks that can't be overcome, but the question is, are we taking more steps for prevention, and are we better prepared to respond? And those are two different questions, and they're both very important for the business of this committee.
Hey, thank you, Mr. Masterson. And I'll go back to the fire chief, Mr. Case. So I guess what I was trying to get at, and maybe unsuccessfully with Mr. Masterson there, is the fact I find it quite troubling that your firefighters would be driving up potentially to an explosive scene or even just a potentially dangerous scene and not have immediate information as to what they're going into. So first of all, I just want to clarify that I did understand you correctly in that.
Yeah, if we can just illuminate the microphone of Chief Case. There you go.
It very much depends on the call. If we get a derailment and an accident, a 911 call will be made, and that information will be key. The dispatcher will then send a fire crew to a railway derailment, potential chemicals involved. It could be the case that the rail company phones in and says exactly what it is, and we've got plans in place. But when you look at where it could happen, what could be around there, the differences, there are so many variables. It would be really, really difficult to have a very specific plan for that one specific incident, should it happen at any time of day or night.
I just, like Mr. Masterson, I just see your members as being incredibly valuable in this, and being if they are able to, like, it's not just one chemical; it might be multiple chemicals mixing together, which can create entirely different circumstances. And as much as the firefighters might train, there's just no way that they're going to be able to understand that. So I guess I'll leave it there. I've got another question, and I'll come back to you, gentlemen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lawrence. Prochainement, nous avons Monsieur Lauzon. Monsieur Lauzon, la parole est à vous.
We'll go now to Mr. Stéphane Lauzon for 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. This is something that affects me personally. I want to start with Mr. Masterson. Based on my experience as the chair for public safety in Gatineau, we have 6 intersections where we have dealt with those who are involved with transit crossings, the federal government, the TSB, and others. But I don't remember when an organization like yours, the CIAC, has been involved. So do you usually work through Transport Canada or the Transportation Safety Board for providing your recommendations and dealing with social responsibility in the public?
It's the association for the producers. We deal with the policymakers, the regulators, the lawmakers. The individual companies will be engaging with municipalities on incidents involving their goods and how to prepare for that. We do some collective work. I mentioned the work on TransCare and TEEP, which is collective across our association. And we have visited Gatineau in the past, and we visited Ottawa in the past, and many of the municipalities represented on this call. And that is done through the association. But again, it's the expertise of our member companies and the railways and emergency responders that do come.
Mais est-ce que une question complémentaire à ça?
Well, I have a follow-up question to that you haven't yet answered. What about the social buy-in? Do you need that so that before putting in a new product or a new delivery system?
Well, it's a highly regulated industry, and there's very little that's as highly regulated as the transportation dangerous goods, and it's a very thorough regime. And again, this is a question of improving it for the future, and we're all for that. We are involved with Transport Canada with their dangerous goods committees to bring the industry together and respond to the proposals being made. And I don't think if you ask Transport Canada, you would hear resistance from industry, whether that's the shippers or the carriers, to these measures. It's how do we do this in a way that's actually achievable?
Mr.
And the question that has come up, if I may add one brief thing, again, about the information that's available, we should commend groups like the Railway Association of Canada and its members that have put in the Ask Rail app on their phones so that the first responders immediately, they see a car number, they can put that in, they will know the product, and they'll know if it's full or empty, and it will link them right away to other information they need, including who to call and the Canutech information on how to handle that safely. There's a lot of information, so we can do better, but let's not make the assumption that there's no information, or the industry or the railways are trying to keep this private. That is not the case.
That's not the case, Mr. Case. But I have a simple question for you. Moi, je représente maintenant les petites.
I represent small municipalities. There are 41 in my riding. There are a lot of industries. We move chemicals, and we have mostly volunteer firefighters. They can't even necessarily deal with a 2 or 3 floor building. They don't even have a truck with that kind of ladder. So we're talking about training and national coordination for these municipalities. I can't imagine the gap between the reality and what needs to be done. So what can we do concretely to get as close as possible to what we need? This is going to take a lot of time, I know. Thank you for that question. It's a very important one. And we can say that we are calling for a national fire administration. We've mentioned this.
The issues that will be in the blind spots. And we need to better engage the fire sector up front in this type of planning. So I can see my red card is there, so.
I'll give you another 10 seconds.
Okay, yeah. Our best recommendation is for a national fire administration, and we'd be happy to give the committee more information. Thank you.
Thank you. Feel free to submit any additional information you'd like us to consider as testimony. Thank you for that. Merci, Monsieur Lauzon. Next, we'll go back.
Mr. Lauzon.
Yours, 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you. So I'll get back to the line of questioning I was on before. One of the elements that came up was with respect to batteries, and so obviously there's going to be, with the growth in the electric car sector and electric buses, there are going to be some massive batteries and massive amounts of batteries that are going to go on the rails. And we've all seen videos of firefighters trying to put out just on a single vehicle battery and it reigniting. And so what training or what resources has Transport Canada given you, or has any of the federal government given you any support with respect to those batteries?
Thank you for the question. Through you, Mr. Chair. When it comes to lithium-ion batteries, somebody once commented to me that if you ask 5 firefighters their opinion on how to fight a lithium-ion battery, you'll get 8 different answers. So we do not have a single guidance on how to do this. And in addition to the fact that this is being placed on a rail card and being put through communities, the whole issue of lithium batteries was one of the big things that my 50 colleagues talked about 2 weeks ago when they came to visit you and your colleagues, is that is just an example of the unknown that's coming down the pipe, that we are yet to understand the full ramifications for all fire departments, not just the small volunteer fire departments, but even the larger ones as well. Every conversation I have with fire chiefs, lithium-ion batteries comes up. Cancer prevention, lithium-ion batteries, fire code. changes. It's always one of the first things we talk about, because there's one thing we do not like is not knowing how to deal with something. And to a certain extent, lithium-ion batteries is a big unknown at the moment.
Wow. So with the massive amounts of lithium-ion batteries that are going to be on our rails and on our roads, we don't currently have a set federal standard as to how to deal with those. Is that correct? I'm not criticizing, by the way. I think this is a problem we need to solve.
Through you, Mr. Chair. We turn to the National Fire Protection Association in the US a lot. They're beginning to develop standards. But from a fire chief perspective, one of the reasons why I'd like to see a national fire administrator is because that's the question that your administrator would be putting to you at policy. Let's talk about how we're going to do this. Let's get that guidance down to all fire chiefs. Because once we know what we're dealing with and what we need to do, believe me, we can then go and seek funding from whoever to try and get the equipment we need. But again, we keep repeating this, but everything comes back to there needs to be a single person at the federal level who can advise policymakers, who can bring forward that perspective so these gaps don't appear.
Not to put too fine a point on it, and I understand if I'm probably putting you in an unfair position, though, but let's say tomorrow that a train derails containing a large amount of sodium-ion batteries. What's your plan of attack?
Mr. Chair, first of all, let's hope not. Secondly, it's evacuation. Like I say, we've got two choices. We move the bad stuff away from the people, or we move the people away from the bad stuff. And if you to get an incident of that magnitude, which we see now with, we see with some lithium-ion batteries, we're seeing quite large cells being placed in wind turbine farms to collect and maintain energy. All of those are designed to a certain extent with evacuation, getting people away. I know one of my colleagues has equipped his vehicles with chains so that if there's a vehicle fire, a battery fire up against a building, they'll physically pull the vehicle away from the building. That's the level of intervention that we've got right now.
But I mean, I think it's fair to say that it's concerning or highly concerning, the lack of a standard with respect to for firefighters to rely on to attack a sodium-ion battery fire. Is that fair?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I can tell you that speaking to colleagues around the world, the fact that the technology of lithium-ion batteries is advancing so quickly, it's going to be very difficult to keep up with it in terms of what can be a response. That's one of the benefits of such an agile industry. But yes, this is the type of thing where we'd very much like to see. We would like to see federal guidance on this. Same way we'd like to see federal guidance on cancer prevention and PFAS and bunker gear. A single voice of leadership would be much appreciated.
Thank you. Hold on.
Yes,
Thank you, Mr. Case, for your excellent testimony. I do apologize for putting you on the spot a little bit.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lawrence. Next, we'll go to Mr. Badaway. Mr. Badaway, the floor is yours. 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chief, I want to give you the opportunity, as well as the mayor, the opportunity to speak a bit more in depth about the National Fire Administration. It seems to be the topic of your passion today with respect to trying to get this off the ground, and quite frankly, I agree with you. One point of contact is very beneficial to streamline a coordinated approach of relevant partners to any given situation. I know, again, I've been in situations in the past where it was like 3 o'clock in the morning and we would have a ship coming into the Welland Canal that everyone on the ship was sick, and we don't know why. And it was delegated to my fire chief versus Health Canada. Very frustrating. So simply to have that protocol in place before the fact versus trying to deal with it during or even after the fact would be beneficial. May I first request that you submit the report that you've authored, not you, but your association, Tina, that you authored to us so we can actually enter it into the testimony, and then therefore it would be reflected on the record to be included with the final recommendations, or the final report, and then therefore the recommendations that the analysts will provide us. Having said that, I'd like you to comment on the emergency management attached to local, provincial, and national priorities. and the alignment of same. I know that's one of your priorities within the plan of the moving forward with the National Fire Administration. So I'd like you to talk a bit more in depth about that and your thoughts on how it does align with, especially in our case, our jurisdiction, with national priorities.
Thank you for the question, sir. Through you, Mr. Chair, when you look at the things that Canada is now facing in terms of wildfires, in terms of climate change, in terms of all the aspects we've talked about today, to be able to have that single voice that can advise the federal level, as well as having, the provincial level as well, to be able to see those three levels of government be more aligned would be gratefully received by first responders. And I'm speaking from personal experience about some of the incidents I've dealt with in the past, where we've had some real, evacuations, explosions and that type of thing. We go straight to the province, but to see that leadership on all three levels would be very reassuring for the community. The fact that we're all seen to be aligned and everybody is looking at this, from what I've seen in the past, that really would be appreciated more by the people who we serve. I think it would send a real powerful message to the communities.
And to that, again, as I mentioned earlier, there is a reality attached to the costs, which I'm sure you struggle with every single day. You're right, policing, it's more HR related. 95 to 96% of a police budget is human resources, collective agreement, and about 4 or 5% is the capital side of it in terms of equipment and so on and so forth. EMS, as you mentioned correctly, is half covered by the provinces, and you are simply covered by the property taxpayers. That includes your HR, your human resources, as well as your suppression equipment, your vehicles, and the list goes on. Totally driven by costs to the property taxpayers. When we run into situations like wildfires, climate change, disaster mitigation, again, property taxpayers, water, wastewater, ratepayers, which then can be a burden on them. So with that, do you find that a lot of the mechanisms that we're putting in place at all levels of government, at the federal level, we have the carbon tax, that a portion goes to municipalities to cover some of those costs that would otherwise be defaulted to a property taxpayer. We have the disaster mitigation fund. We have the community, the Canada Community Building Fund, and the list goes on with respect to some of those contributions that we're making at the federal level. Provincial level, we would expect would do the same, and of course, other partners, such as the private sector within their own organizations and sectors, would do the same. Do you find any other funding mechanisms that can be made available to otherwise cover some of those costs? Tina?
Yes, thank you very much for the question.
Est-ce que c'est à moi? Oui, OK. Je pensais que c'était à moi la question. Non.
I thought I was being asked the question.
Tina,
Sure.
I would love to give the mayor an opportunity
Absolutely,
to speak because
please.
he's at that level. So, Mr. Mayor, I would love to hear your comments.
Oui, merci.
Thank you.
Dans-
As long as the rail companies and those who are shipping the hazardous goods as freight are not accountable for damage that is caused, whether it's an incident or it's an accident, then they're going to be comfortable with the status quo, because right now we talk about the responsibility and it falls to firefighters and the municipalities only. We hear the philosophy that they are working to limit damage, but they work to limit the damage. Yes, that is true. That is quite true. But they say this, and we're having confirmation today, but we need to change the paradigm to have the rail companies and the shippers be accountable for that damage.
Si vous
And
permettez,
if I
Monsieur le
might,
Président, je vais juste donner un
Mr.
exemple.
Chairman, just an example I'd like to give. what happened in Lac Mégantic, it wasn't the companies that paid, it was the government. It cost over $500 million, and it was taxpayers that footed the bill. So I would just like to conclude with that concrete example of Lac Mégantic.
Thank you, Mr. Barouet. Prochainement, nous avons Monsieur Barcelou-Duval, 2
We
minutes et
will now
demie.
go to Mr. Barcelou-Duval for 2 minutes, please. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would first like to thank Mr. Case for the evidence he has given right now. I haven't had a chance to ask him any questions. It'll depend if I have enough time to do so. But one of my colleagues raised a point I want to come back to, and that was the issue of batteries. We have new technologies, and I think it's an important issue to raise. But I wonder if it was a question that came out of self-interest or not, because when we are talking about hazardous goods, we talk about Lac Mégantic, and I think it's true as well in the area represented by the mayor, Saint-Basile-le-Grand, because what we have mostly in those freight cars are petroleum products. And it was mentioned earlier by the mayor that the best way to prevent the incidents, and we know that in Lac Mégantic it was petroleum products that caused the death of 47 people, and we know in Sorel and other areas of my riding, people are worried about those kinds of products. So we need to deal with the problem at its source, and that is the petroleum products. We need to move forward with the energy transition and get these products out of the market, or at least reduce their presence considerably. Is this part of the answer, do you believe? We have to recognize one thing, and that is that we're going to have oil and other petroleum products and other hazardous goods that are going to be moved for quite a long time yet, and we need to make sure to protect our municipalities by having rail sidelines so that we can get these products out of the way.
Finally, for today, we have Mr. Bachrach. Mr. Bachrach, the floor is yours. 2.5 minutes, sir.
I want to thank all of our witnesses. This has been really excellent testimony. Mr. Case, your recommendation around a national fire administration is one that we'll certainly take to heart. I can pledge to you that I'll do my part in trying to ensure that it's among the recommendations in this report. I did want to go back to community preparedness and this wide variation that we see among communities of different sizes. In my region, local fire departments are offered training by the shippers several times per year, once per year. I'm not sure the frequency. I've had a chance to observe some of that training, and I think it's certainly better than nothing. The question is around whether there should be national standards for community preparedness and capacity. I don't think that many residents of our small communities understand the limitations of first responders. Like our fire departments, our first responders do incredible work, and they do incredible work within serious limitations. The question is whether there should be some thought put to establishing a standard for communities to respond to dangerous goods incidents, or whether the current patchwork of volunteer training opportunities is adequate to really protect lives. We've had the conversation about how the costs should be distributed. I think they have to be distributed fairly. That's a clear point. But when it comes to having adequate and sufficient response capacity, having the capability, having enough water, having enough materials, having enough trained people, should there be some sort of standardization across the country so communities know that they are adequately protected?
Thank you for the question. Through you, Mr. Chair. We've talked a lot about leadership, and we see differences between the different provinces. I'll give you one brief example. When we talk about incident command, it's an incident command system. In some provinces, emergency management is an incident management system, which sounds like a difference in language, but it's a difference in approach. So when we talk about the National Fire Administrator and when we talk about the lessons learned from Megontic, leadership is what's needed right now. And I think to have any kind of leadership at the federal level, which comes down to a community, is going to be significant. And I'll draw your attention again to the E2 regulations, where large producers of dangerous goods have to consider the community, they have to consider their emergency response plans, they have to consider what they do with us as responders. And that might very well be a model. But I appreciate the questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Bachrach. And Mr. Case, Chief Case, I want to thank you for your service on behalf of all members of our community, as well as your testimony today. I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here and sharing with us and contributing to this very important study. With that, I want to wish everyone a wonderful evening, and this meeting is adjourned.